On June 6, 2006, a woman in her 30s named Judith walked into the Arizona State Mental Hospital in Phoenix. She calmly indicated to the staff that she was admitting herself, but refused to explain why until she spoke to a therapist. After an hour, she was admitted. The next day, she shared her story with a therapist who prefers to remain anonymous. According to Judith, 50,000 homeless people die every year. It's a mystery how many people vanish without a trace, but I know. I was born in Salem, Massachusetts on June 6, 1906. Life was pretty good growing up in a well-off family until 1929 came around. I can still picture the exact moment. My father walking in on the evening of October 30th. His usually lively demeanor was replaced with a heavy sadness like someone had stolen his spirit. It was a moment I'll never forget. Can you believe it? Instead of joining us for dinner, this person casually hung up their hat and jacket, didn't say a word, and then went upstairs to their room. We all exchanged worried glances as my mom got up to go check on them. Suddenly, there was a huge bang that shook the whole house. I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I realized what had happened. My mom called out for Paul as she ran upstairs, while my siblings just looked at me in confusion. So Jacob noticed something was wrong and asked Judith about the loud bang. I didn't say anything, just kept crying. Our mom's screams were terrifying as she cried for Paul. My siblings ran upstairs in a panic. Their cries still echo in my head. I stayed at the dining table for hours, never moving. And that was the last time I saw my father. A few days later, we buried him. The next week, we found out the reason he had taken his own life. He had lost something very dear to him. It was a tough time for us last year when we lost everything in a sudden crash. We had to leave our house and figure out how to survive on the streets. My mom didn't have any family to turn to, and my dad had distanced himself from his siblings who had tried to take advantage of him. We felt all alone, as even our friends had lost everything. As winter approached, my mom did her best to manage the little money we had left. She had left us, and we decided to start over by traveling down south where it was warmer. Little did she know that our journey would lead us to a difficult situation. It took some time to make it to Birmingham, Alabama, but when we did, we found ourselves staying in a homeless shelter. Things were okay for a while, but as winter approached, more people sought shelter in the city and we were forced to leave. We ended up finding a place to stay in an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. Luckily, my mother was able to find work at a factory. While my mother was out working long hours each day to barely make ends meet, I took care of my siblings. We often had to scavenge for food or come up with creative ways to put meals on the table. This routine continued for months until May 1930. I remember one night, Mother came back later than usual and looked completely exhausted. I could see the defeat in her eyes as I got ready to go out and find food and water for all of us. She passed me the money she had earned that day, and I headed out. I usually didn't take long, but since it was getting late, my usual store was closed. So I had to walk a little further to another one that was still open. On my way back, I noticed how surprisingly bright it was, even though it was so late. Looking up, I could see the full moon shining above the tall buildings. I couldn't even remember the last time I had seen a full moon or paid it any attention. Suddenly, I got this weird feeling that something wasn't quite right. I was so scared that my ears started ringing, and I paused to look around. There was nothing but the silence of an empty street. I quickly walked home, and as I reached the outside of our building, I heard loud murmuring. I thought it was just my siblings fighting. I stopped to light a candle before going up the stairs. It wasn't until I reached the 4th floor that I heard the horrific shrieks of my family. I dropped everything except the candle and ran down the hallway towards our. As I approached the room, I noticed it was completely dark. When I entered, something quickly swatted the candle out of my hand before I could catch a glimpse of a mysterious creature I had never seen before. The impact from the blow threw me across the room, knocking me unconscious. During my time out, I experienced terrifying dreams where I saw through the eyes of a strange entity hunting down a young couple as they walked down the street. It was a surreal and frightening experience. As I was about to pounce on them, I suddenly jolted myself awake. I jumped up and started looking around for my family, but they were gone. Only the red stains of their blood remained. I looked down at myself and noticed my clothes were torn to shreds. I was covered in dry blood, but there were no marks or wounds on me. I searched the entire building hoping to find my family, but there was no trace of them. Then, next to finding my father taking his life, that was the worst day of my life. I was in such disarray that I couldn't even cry. I sat in that blood-stained room all alone. I spent the day considering my options. If I went to the police, I knew they wouldn't be able to find anything besides the bloodstains, which I might be blamed for. So I decided to head to the coast and catch a boat to Europe. There was nothing left for me in America. Before going to sleep that night, I realized I needed more water and food, so I went out. The last thing I remember while walking down the street was having what seemed like a very clear dream where I was once again looking through the eyes of someone or something. I found myself in a bedroom with two young children who were fast asleep. As I crept closer, I couldn't control the dark thoughts in my mind. I was screaming at myself to stop, but I couldn't resist tearing them to pieces in my mind. Just as I was about to do something awful, I suddenly woke up in a blood-stained room. I screamed in shock as I realized I was wearing different clothes. This was all so confusing. Why was I dreaming such terrible things? Why me? Someone told me to leave Birmingham as I cried, and I wasted no time doing just that. 3 days later, I finally made it to Mobile after a combination of walking and getting rides from strangers. I asked around and managed to find a cargo ship that was on its way to Portugal. Luckily, I befriended a crew member who was around my age. He kindly agreed to let me stay in the cargo hold as long as I stayed out of sight. He promised to bring me food and water whenever I needed it. I honestly have no clue how long the journey lasted, but it felt like forever. I stayed hidden in the cargo hold the entire time. When we finally arrived, he snuck me off the ship. Once I got off the ship, I never saw him again. My first few days in a new place were pretty rough because I couldn't speak or read the language. I ended up sleeping on the streets and eating scraps from the garbage. It wasn't until I stumbled upon a homeless shelter that things started to look up. That evening, as I sat down to have a meal, I noticed a man in his 50s who couldn't take his eyes off me from a few tables away. At first, I thought he was just being weird, but then he came over and sat across from me. I once met someone who claimed they could tell I was from America as soon as they saw me. It caught me off guard, as I had never encountered anyone like that before. They mentioned they could sense others like me would come eventually. When I asked how they knew, they simply said they could smell it on me. I was confused and asked if they had been attacked by something they couldn't explain. It was certainly a unique encounter. I was sitting there in silence, completely shocked that he knew. Eventually, I managed to find the words and said, "Yes, whatever it was, killed my entire family, and now you've become one." He replied, "We've been called many names over the years. To some, we're known as death. To others, we're one of God's mistakes." There was a long silence between us, and then he asked, "When was the last time you were outside under a full moon?" I paused for a while, wondering why he was asking, and then it hit me, back in. Even before he said that, I felt like there had been a change inside of me. Something was very different with my body. I had cravings for things I'd never had before. I felt stronger and more aware of my surroundings. After we finished eating, he stood up and said, "Come with me, all right." America and I had the most sadistic, horrifying dream I'd ever had. It felt so real. I replied, "That happens in the beginning stages. You don't know what you are yet, but I will show you what was never shown to me." I got up and started to follow him. We spent the night wandering the streets of Lisbon, and for some reason, even though I didn't know why, I had the feeling that I could trust him. He looked up at the sky and said, "The next full moon is in 7 days. That's enough time to prepare me for what I asked." He grinned slightly and said, "You shall see." He talked for hours, telling me stories and explaining some things I needed to know about who we were, the history of our kind, what we needed, and what would kill us. It felt real, as if he had laid it all out for me. We kept a low profile for the next 6 days. The day before the full moon, he said, "You have to kill every full moon. Who you kill is of the utmost importance. You must kill those who will not be missed or searched for. You must kill the homeless, doing otherwise will get you killed by those whose constant search is for us." At that point, I realized why my family was killed. Growing up, I had heard and read stories like this, but I never believed any of them. I should have been crying, not just because my body grew stronger, but because my mind did too. As evening fell on the first day of the full moon, we stood across the street from the homeless shelter. When it filled up and people were turned away, searching for another place to rest, we saw the remaining homeless start to leave. One man went in a different direction from the rest, and we decided to follow him. "Just do what I do," my friend whispered. We waited until he was a few blocks away before we started tracking him. Remember, when the moon is at its highest point, it will be time to act. He said that we followed him until he moved to his temporary camp outside of the city, and that we stayed in the shadows waiting for the moon to reach its peak hours. A full moon gives us life and power. Without it, we are nothing. Never forget that. He replied. I said nothing as I nodded my head. It's not long now. You will still not have control over yourself when you transform. That will come with time. I was worried since I knew the time was drawing near. He then looked up into the sky. We slowly approached the sleeping man and started tearing him apart as we ate the pieces, until there was nothing left except for his blood-stained clothing, which we disposed of later, so there was no evidence. It all happened so quickly the man never knew what was happening down at me and said, "It's now time, my child." At that moment, I felt myself start to change, and like before, it felt like I was looking through the eyes of something that was not me. Took his life that night was a turning point in my life, and I fully accepted who I had become. We spent decades traveling throughout Europe and parts of Asia, where he continued to teach me about our kind and what I needed to know to survive. 40 years later, we decided to part ways, with me longing to see how America had changed, and him not wanting to leave the old world. I knew I would never see him again, because so much had happened in the 40 years. It took hours now after landing in Seattle. I traveled down the coast for the next 10 years, eventually settling in Phoenix. I can't say that I remember most of my kills, but the one I vowed would be my last will haunt me till the day my soul leaves this earth. Over the years, I killed anyone without feeling guilty. Women, children, the young, the old, it didn't matter. But the last one really got to me. I was tracking a mother and her 2 small children, intending to murder them. When I got inside the house, I could hear them laughing and talking, which made me pause for a moment, but my hunger drove me on. I'll never forget the looks of dread on their faces as I entered the room they were in. They immediately started screaming, so I ran over and killed the mother, and then turned on one of the children just as I was about to kill the last one. The house was away from anyone else, which was good, because no one would hear their screams right before the moon peaked. He was exactly like my younger brother Jacob. I was taken aback by what I saw, and I couldn't believe my eyes. He got up to run, but instinct took control, and I quickly killed him. After eating them and turning back into myself, I realized that something had changed inside of me. That night, I decided to end my life, but not in the way you're able to do it. I can't just put a gun to my head and pull the trigger. I have to stay away from the very thing that gives me power in life, the moon. Now that you know why I was admitting myself here, you may move on. Judith's appearance began to drastically change every day, making her appear older and older until she had the appearance of a 100-year-old woman. 8 months after admitting herself to the hospital, she was found in her bed, shriveled and dead. The therapist naturally assumed Judith was crazy, but she was allowed to stay over the months. She told her life stories to the same therapist who recorded them. Her therapist had her burned and her ashes scattered in the desert outside of Phoenix because there was no reason for her abrupt age increase. Please subscribe for more terrifying horror stories.